I've called this presentation as India's inclusion inflection, because I think, as you rightly said, we have, in this crisis, we have a wonderful opportunity. And I'm very grateful to you for giving me this chance to speak at this event, because it also gave me a chance to work with people like Lalitesh and Rahul and others to put together a sort of an overview of what's possible. Now, a lot of the digital foundation is already in place, and we'll talk about that in terms of Aadhaar, UPI, AEPS, and so on, bank accounts. But if you really want to reach everyone, I think we have to think of two important things. One is we have to have a role for communities in what we do, because for the well-to-do, it is about do it yourself. It's using your own smartphone to do things. But for a large part of the population, it is they benefit from being part of a community. And the second is that digital financial services is nothing but a foundation for livelihoods. And therefore, we have to think of how to think of digital financial services as a fundamental bridgehead into solving the livelihood issue. So I think it's time to create community-centric digital livelihoods ecosystems that empower 1 billion Indians. And that's the vision that I will talk about today. Now, this crisis has been around for a long time. We have 240 million people who are starving, 2.4 million deaths per year on malnutrition, and more than 50% of graduates are unemployable after completing college. And what is very important is that 100 million people in this country have 90% of India's disposable income. This is pretty inequitable, because if 100 million people have 90% of India's disposable income, then what really is happening to the rest? And all the sort of startups that we see, or all the excitement we have about unicorns and this and that, is really about people solving the problems of these 100 million people. You know, today the total number of people using e-commerce must be 20 to 30 million. The total number of people using UPI is about 100 million. The total number of people using ride sharing may be about 20-30 million. So really it goes back to the same old 100 million people who use all these services. And our challenge is much, much bigger than that. And COVID in particular has completely breached the development dam. So today, 50% of households have lost 3/4 of the income. This is what you're also talking about. 75% primary income earners have lost their livelihoods. 25% of families have exhausted their savings, and we are still in the early days of COVID. And if we assume that this crisis will continue for a few more months or even up to a year, then we are looking at even more serious challenge of people falling into poverty. And 40% of our citizens are taking on more debt to get through it, and that will only go up in the coming months. So we have really, COVID has been a huge, huge setback in our journey to improve the lives of the informal sector. Now, to some extent, we have been able to sort of handle this through the infrastructure which we already have. The estimate is that about 160 million people received financial assistance via DBT through the various DBT programs of the government. And because of the DBT and the Aadhaar payment bridge and all that, they went directly into their bank accounts. Today, we have about 700 million people who have linked their bank accounts to Aadhaar. So we are able to, government was able to transfer money. And that was very, very useful. Just to give you a sense of the scale of what happened in the months of May and June, the AEPS system did 400 million transactions each month to about 100 to 150 million people withdrawing money. And we have about 100 million people who are able to do digital payments from home, and they have used all kinds of apps, whether it is PhonePe or Google Pay, or tomorrow it will be WhatsApp Pay and so on, Paytm and so on. So I think they are quite, as these 100 million people are able to operate. And then 30% of the GDP has actually been enabled by digital mobility because of the fact that many of the people in the top 30-40 million people are able to work from home. I mean, the entire IT sector and BPO sector is working from home. They're able to do banking digitally. They're able to order groceries and so on. So this again meant that a fraction of the population is able to do quite well in this situation, but the problem continues to be for the vulnerable. Now, we have in the last several years put in place a way to think about digital cash or cashless transactions. We have 1.25 billion people on Aadhaar. We have 100 million UPI active users. And if you recollect the committee report on deepening payments that we did, we said this 100 million would go to 300 million in the next 2-3 years. And UPI, after a reduction in volume in the month of April, has come back to 1.5 billion transactions in July, which is the highest ever. And the stated goal of NPCI is to take this 1.5 billion a month to 1 billion a day in the next few years. And there are many exciting and interesting things happening here. For example, the recurring mandate got launched a few days back, about I think a month back, and recurring mandates is very good for EMI payments, repayments, for subscriptions, for SIPs. All kinds of applications are there, so we expect recurring mandate will have a big impact. And there are many other innovations that UPI will have in the coming years, all of which will enable it to still go to a billion a day, except this billion a day again goes back to the same 300 million people of the top end of the population. And also once WhatsApp goes live on UPI, which hopefully will happen once they sort out all the regulatory issues, then that will also lead to a huge jump in UPI consumption. So I think we have something going for the top 300 million. Now, a reason for all this is that we have democratized financial systems in 4 ways. One is we have democratized identity, and Aadhaar is a law, and now so that's all set, and the Aadhaar-enabled payment system showed the value of Aadhaar in the resilience that we are able to do in doing the DBT to everyone. Privacy is getting democratized because we now have a fundamental right to privacy as said by the Supreme Court. We have Aadhaar law has been seen to meet those privacy requirements, and there's a data privacy bill on the cards which hopefully will get passed one of these days. Data is democratized because of the whole account aggregator network we have, which allows people to use their own data to use it for their own benefit. And as part of that, again, if you remember 3-4 weeks back, the Open Credit Enabled Network was launched, OCEN, which is a way to connect loan providers to borrowers. So all these APIs will streamline the ability to deliver credit. And finally, payments are democratized in 2 ways. One is, of course, through UPI, which is available today on smartphones and feature phones. And the other, for those who don't have any phones or so on, they can use the AEPS and withdraw money, which, as I said, in the month of May and June, had 400 million transactions each. So I think all the fundamental infrastructure is in place, but there are a few things we need to do. But all the fundamental infrastructure is in place to take this forward. Now, beyond the first 100 million people, another big initiative which is happening is the unleashing of credit for MSMEs, which is happening through all these various initiatives. Now, with the ability to use GST data, which hopefully will become a reality soon, using the account aggregator framework, a small business can access GST and use their own invoice data and get a loan. And they would use the account aggregator framework for that. And the OCEN network, OCEN APIs will be able to connect a large number of lenders with a large number of borrowers. And that in turn can be done by different loan service providers who actually perhaps provide some other capability to the a customer, and they can also provide a loan using inline, OCEN calls. So we now have the infrastructure getting into place for business credit, which we think can be done at large scale, and we are in the early days of this. And this is estimated, this is a 5-year estimate from the MSME report and other reports, that if we do this right, 10 million SMEs who are either in the GST system or are supplying on an e-commerce marketplace can get a $200 billion loan gap can be filled with which will affect about 150 million lives. So when you think about this, at the top end, 100 million people who are 90% of India's income have all the facilities now to make their lives work. They can order at home, groceries at home, whatever. Another 150 million people perhaps will be impacted, and the benefit will come when we get this digital credit for SMEs going. But then this will really lead to, we think, what would be the world's fastest growing fintech ecosystem, which is really at planet scale. And what's important is that this is an ecosystem which has many, many players, and therefore it's much more democratized than other countries that have rapidly implemented fintech. Having said this, our challenge is really not those people, but really the 600 million people who are really need inclusion. These are the people that many of you are dealing with, and this is really the crowd which is not going to benefit from many of these things. For one, they don't have smartphones. If you look at the number of smartphones in the country, while we claim we have 400 to 500 million smartphones, the number of unique smartphone users would probably be more like 300 million. And another 300 million people would have feature phones. So the 600 million people are either people who have no phones or have feature phones and can't participate in this smartphone economy. Because they are not in the system, they have no credit history, so there's nothing we know about them, and therefore their access to credit is very poor. And their access to credit is purely informal, proximity-based, at very high interest rates. I don't need to explain to you all this issue. So the gap is not the desire or the capacity, but really the gap is cash, because these people are all operating in a cash economy. Now, cash is something, as you just mentioned, cash destroys economic velocity, because cash can only be used in proximity. So I can only give cash to somebody else when I meet them. And what we realized in COVID was that if people are not in meeting other people, then how do we collect the cash, or how do we give them the cash? And therefore, one advantage of digital cash is the fact that it is contactless. But today, the farmer and these micro SME is dealing only in cash, and therefore they will have trouble getting paid, they'll have trouble paying back loans, they can't get new loans, so they're in this trap of huge trap. And while we are getting our produce in the cities, the farmer is not really getting the benefit because they only deal in cash. And therefore, it's all very well to talk about all this fintech, but unless we solve the challenges of the 600 million people who are outside, and unless we use data and technology to bring them inside, we will not have achieved our goals. Now, because cash is dark in the sense that you don't know how it's moving, it is keeping people in dark. So we have 140 million farmers, 60 million micro entrepreneurs, and about 400 million informal workers who have no history of income, of produce, or of work. So even when we talk about the GST, remember the GST is only about 10 million businesses, whereas the country has maybe 70 to 100 million businesses, small businesses, including the vegetable vendor and so on. And therefore, even the GST data applies only to the top end of the SMEs. And the 60 million micro entrepreneurs we have, the 400 million informal workers we have, and the 140 million farmers we have are completely out of the loop. And because this is dark cash, we don't know what is the output, they get no credit, and therefore data, we call this as data darkness, because we don't even know, have any knowledge about these folks. So if we're really talking about digital, the challenge is how do we get these 600 million people into the digital ecosystem? And that is really going to be the challenge we will now have to face in the coming months. And I'll talk about how we can get about doing that. Now, the good news is that many things are either happening or can be done. And this is where all of you come in, because this is your target audience in some sense. And we have to do more things on the technology to make it much more suitable for the vulnerable and so on. Now, one thing has already happened is that one of the things that we had predicted about 4 years back was that everybody can be an ATM in the UPI world. And that is now happening with the merchant cash circular, which has NPCI has issued, which legitimizes a transaction where I transfer money digitally to somebody and they in turn give me physical cash. So I can go to a BC or a merchant or anybody with a UPI phone, and I can transfer digitally money to them and they can give me cash. So everybody becomes an ATM. So this is fundamentally very good, because for digital cash to succeed, people must have the confidence that anytime they can convert it to physical cash. So they need that safety net. So that is now done with this UPI merchant cash circular. The second thing is, how do we make UPI more ubiquitous? Because UPI is fundamentally a self-service model where I use it, say, on my own smartphone. And the way to think about this is now we know that we can, I think, given that we have about 600, 700 million phones and 607 million bank accounts uniquely linked to Aadhaar. We know that from the Aadhaar payment bridge stuff, that we know that every household has a bank account. We think that's pretty much there. And we think that every household has either a smartphone or a feature phone. And in rural areas, probably 25% would be smartphone. So or 20% would be smartphone. So for every household with a smartphone, we would have 4 households with a feature phone. Now, if the feature phone users can come to the smartphone neighbor and use UPI on their smartphone, then suddenly we can 4x the number of people who have access to UPI. And this will require a change, which we will have to request NPCI to do. This is where you guys all come in. And this should be that if I have a feature phone, using my feature, I have a feature phone and I have a bank account and I have Aadhaar. Those 3 things are there. I use my mobile number as a virtual payment address for Aadhaar, for my bank account, and I operate my bank account on my neighbor's smartphone. This sounds, you may say, what am I talking about? But fundamentally, it is about providing everyone who has a feature phone assisted access to UPI on somebody else's smartphone using the phone number as the virtual payment address. The other thing is, how about UPI on the feature phone itself? This is the self-service mode on feature phones. Now, UPI is already available on feature phones. In fact, during the demonetization crisis, NPCI had an old USSD-based payment system. They completely revamped it in a matter of weeks and then made it work on a feature phone. So UPI technically works on the feature phone, but it has not really been a big success because I think using the USSD and all that is a very clumsy way of doing things. So UPI on feature phone has not taken off. But I think this was done three years back, but now we have a very significant development, which is that we can now use AI to provide message and voice interactivity to UPI on feature phone. In other words, as you mentioned, Sucharita, that voice is the way people use Google search or whatever. If we can provide UPI on feature phone using voice and messaging, then it's more likely to be used. And this is where AI will come in, because we will use AI for voice recognition, machine translation, etc. And now a lot of good work has happened in machine translation in Indian languages. One of the projects that my colleague Vivek Raghavan has been involved with the Supreme Court is to provide instant translation in 9 Indian languages and English, bidirectional. So we can translate a legal document, a judgment or a witness document or whatever from English to Hindi, Hindi to English, English to Tamil, Tamil to English in real time. And this is being deployed by the Supreme Court. So now we have this Indian language, voice, speech recognition, machine, all the tech you need, where we can provide, I believe, I mean, this has not been done, so right now this is all speculation. I believe that if we can offer UPI on a feature phone with AI on voice and text, then suddenly UPI will become far more accessible on a feature phone. And that means that the 300 million people who have feature phones can become part of the UPI economy. So this to me is a big thing which all of you should also be demanding. And the third thing is that how do you do a financial transaction on UPI? Now UPI, as you know, has a two-factor authentication. Now one is, the two things we can do. One is we can say that transactions below a single, below a certain amount can be single factor. We already have that. For example, AEPS allows you to do single factor authentication. All you do is a biometric auth and you can withdraw money up to 2,000 rupees or whatever. The same on the debit card, you can do a small transaction without OTP. So the system has already accepted the concept that for small value transactions, we can use a single factor. The second thing is we can also do UPI two-factor, because if the feature, I'm now talking about the assisted mode, if the feature phone is one factor, because it can be either verifying the feature phone or doing an OTP, and on the assisted mode, the other big thing which is coming now is Aadhaar face authentication. So Aadhaar face authentication, I think they have already launched it, and it has yet to come to financial sector. But I do hope that both in the AEPS as well as in UPI, we can do Aadhaar face authentication as a factor of authentication. Now, in AEPS, what that means is that instead of doing a fingerprint auth to withdraw my money, I do a face auth, which is contactless, and that will be a big thing there. And in the case of UPI, I can use face auth for onboarding myself. So because my bank has both my mobile number and my Aadhaar number, I can do a two-factor authentication on my smartphone and immediately connect to UPI. So that will dramatically reduce the onboarding of UPI customers. And I think the combination of WhatsApp coming online and face authentication on onboarding, in my view, will lead to a dramatic surge in onboarding in UPI. And if the face authentication is also used for transactions, then I could use my face authentication on the assisted smartphone to do my second factor. So fundamentally, two-factor authentication will become much simpler now with face coming online. And therefore, all these things that I'm talking about, the first one is done, the next three have to be done, and we have to ask for this. This will lead to a dramatic use of digital cash even among the 600 million people who are vulnerable. And that is the key to it, getting them to get to digital cash, because number one, digital cash can be anytime, anywhere. I can send money to anyone. I don't have to be next to them. It creates a digital footprint. It has, it's really the way to go. And this, I think, is great. So this is something we have to do. Now, while this is very empowering, it's not enough, because livelihoods continue to be at perpetual risk. Today, we have 140 million people in. Is this all getting boring, Sucharita? Huh?
Absolutely not. Just speaking on behalf of the Zoom.
In this Zoom business, you don't know what is happening, whether people are listening, understanding, whatever. Anyway, so 140 million people have 15% of GDP, 140 million farm hands, and 60 million of these micro SMEs is 30% of GDP, which is the 600 million adults. And these people's lives continue to be unrecognized, unstable, and unpredictable. And that is the heart of the problem, and this is only going to continue till we get out of this situation. And we think that these, if we have to solve the challenges of these folks if we're really going to get anywhere in this society. Whereas the 100 million people who are out there, who are all benefiting from all this, they're all doing well, mainly because they are inside the livelihood system. They have degree certificates, they have biodata, they have salaries, they have EPFO, and so on. And they have mobility. If they don't like a job, they can go to some other employer. The MSMEs now, because of UPI, GST, and OCEN, will now have the instruments for many of these things. So, as I again said, the challenge is not the top 100 million so much as the 600 million. And therefore, how do we tackle with that? The problem is that they have no livelihood system. Their livelihood comes from proximity. They have to go and work for somebody physically, face-to-face in his farm or in his shop. They cannot, their reputation is not portable. Even if they spend 5 years doing a great job with one employer, that has no value when they go to another employer because it starts all over again. Their skills are not portable because they are not able to show the skills, and so even if you are an accomplished carpenter, you can't get the premium that you have. So fundamentally, if all your work is proximity based, if all your skills are non-portable, if your reputation is not portable, then you're really stuck. And that's really the challenge that all these people have. And that's because of a lack of a system. And they are basically caught between the input provider, which could be, the fertilizer guy, the output purchaser, who is the guy who buys your produce, and the lender, and they're caught in this trap, whether it's an MSME or a farmer. And this informality of their livelihood is the heart of what we need to crack as we go forward. Now, what that means is that we have to do three things. We have to make the money flow digitized, and the cash I talked about, digital cash is part of that. We have to make their assets visible, which means if I'm a small grocery guy, I should be able to digitally buy and sell and keep inventory, which is visible to somebody to examine my credit worthiness. And obviously, we want them to get access to markets in a much more globalized way, which hopefully will happen as we go towards single domestic agri markets and so on, so that I'm not locked into one buyer in my village. So this is what we need for these people. But the challenge is you cannot do this. What is the structure to do this? Because we cannot do this at an individual level. We cannot really do this for 600 million individuals. And therefore, we have to think of community structures, groups of people doing it. And this is not a new concept. In India, is always focused on groups, whether we talk about self-help groups, farmer-producer organizations. They're all examples of communities. But the challenge that communities have had in India is that they are not able to scale beyond a point. And the reason they're not able to scale is because they don't have digital platforms supporting them. And therefore, they are limited by their scope, is limited by the number of people they can physically meet and so on. And therefore, we need to take existing communities and create new communities, but do something to make them scale up. Make sure that how do we scale them up to do that? And this can be done only by digital platforms. In other words, we have to think of this game not only as financial services, but also livelihoods. And livelihoods need systems beyond the finance. Finance is a foundation. For those systems to be implemented, we need to implement them at communities. And therefore, we need to make communities use these digital platforms. And once we are able to do that, then all the elements of both livelihood and financial systems can come together. And if we can do this at scale, then we can take it everywhere across the country. So what we need therefore is, one is we talked about making it all cash and why the cash is important. Second is we need communities, and we need to use a way of creating trust in communities so that by crowdsourcing data and so on, the good people can build their own reputation so that they get access to all these services. And this community created livelihood system for the next 600 million people, I believe, is what we need. And what happens is, once you make the whole thing digital, we are able to do things efficiently, anytime, anywhere, and so on. And plus we have the digital footprints. And then if you're able to combine the digital infrastructure with community organizations, if you're able to deliver low-cost livelihood services at scale and safely to people, then we actually have a chance of doing something about the hundreds of millions of people who are now excluded. So that is my thesis for today, which is community-centered digital platforms to digitize cash and co-create livelihood systems, and that perhaps is the way at scale and speed we can address the challenge of the 600 million people. And in some sense, that is what I hope all of you are thinking about. Now, many of these things will require new systems and new infrastructure, and I think we all have to work together to make this happen. But I'm sure we can do it, and thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.